Hello everyone, and welcome to the opening session of Text in the City this year at the Wheeler Centre. My name's Ruby J. Murray, and I'm delighted to be co-hosting this year with Andrew McDonald, who's going to be coming in every second week to spend time with you. I've forgotten what most of my Year 12 exams were like, but I haven't forgotten the texts. So this is a really great opportunity for me to come across some of them again, because they've been on these lists a while, some of them, and they never get old. It's more complex than just, people will often say to you, oh, you're going to do Year 12, you're going to hate these texts by the end. But I think it's actually a lot more complex than hate. I've grown to really love a lot of these texts, and this is the only time in your entire lives for some of you that you're going to get to sit down for a whole year with these books and films and really get to know them. So to help us get to know them each week, we're going to have a sort of artistic marriage counselling process for you here. And we've chased down experts and super geeks who have long-term relationships already with these books and films. And this year, we're going to start with the wonderful Thomas Caldwell here next to me to discuss Elia Kazan's On the Waterfront from 1954. Thomas is a film critic and RRR broadcaster, and a recipient of the Ivan Hutchinson Award for writing on Australian film. He also happens to be the author of a secondary school textbook, the Film Analysis Handbook, so it's a perfect match for us to have him here today. His articles and reviews have appeared in places like The Age, The Big Issue, Overland, The Sense of Cinema, Metro and Screen Education, and he blogs at cinemaautopsy.com and regularly talks at high schools across the state. At the end of the session, we are going to open up, oh, you are that wonderful. We are going to open up for audience questions. So right now, just start keeping in mind the sorts of the things you'd like to ask Thomas while you've got him here as a captive person for you. I'd like to start by asking you, Thomas, a little bit about when you first saw On the Waterfront, what it means to you, and what the film meant at the time in 1954 when it first came out.
I wasn't lucky enough to study film when I was at school. It was, I don't know, mid-90s, and I went to a very conservative school who didn't take film seriously. So I got into cinema in a huge way when I went to university. I'd loved film all throughout my life, but at university I discovered that it was a legitimate thing to study and be passionate about. And I studied cinema and political science, and these two things married together really, really well, because cinema is so political, and if you have an understanding of a lot of political ideology, you get to see how it's reflected in cinema, and that got quite exciting. So I went through a phase where I just devoured as much cinema as I could, going to places like the Astor Theatre and Cinema Nova and the Kino, and if Acme had existed back then I would have gone there, and a bunch of cinemas which have now closed. And I just wanted to see all the films by the great directors and the great actors, and Marlon Brando was one of these actors who was you had to see everything he had done, because he was, yeah, and he's amazing. I mean, his screen presence is incredible, and his acting style was radical. The stuff he brought to screen, and we'll probably talk a bit more about that, was, for its time, it just exploded cinema and notions about what acting was all about, especially in film. So I was just keen to see anything he was in, and so I must have gone to a screening of On the Waterfront, possibly at the Astor. It's the kind of thing they would show, and was just mesmerised by the rawness of this film. Films from the 50s in particular are fantastic in the way they express competing ideologies at the time. America was in deep paranoia about communism, and all these films were trying to pursue different agendas, and the stuff that was happening behind the scenes politically is fascinating. And from that came this new style of ultra-realist cinema, you know, this idea of keeping it real, shooting on the streets. It wasn't sets, there weren't big musical numbers, the acting started to get more realistic, and this was just one of those films, and I didn't realise films this gritty were being made as early as 1954. And as much as I loved it, as much as this film blew me away and it excited me, there was something a bit not quite right about it that really worried me, and it was the political subtext.
Before we get you to talk a bit about that, should we maybe have a show of hands in the audience? It's the first week that we've done this, I know you're only just starting out, but who's had time to see the film so far? Wow. All right. Well, we're not going to give you a background then of what the film's about. You all obviously know what the film's about, and congratulations for being so on top of your study. But do you want to talk for us a bit about the political context that the film came out of and Elia Kazan's politicism himself?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how far to go back with this. So often when I talk about this, I start with the 1930s. Look, I won't do that to you.
Start with HUAC, maybe.
HUAC's a good place to start. So this was the House of Un-American Activities. This was a group who became quite active in the 50s. They originally formed to try to get rid of pro-Ku Klux Klan and pro-fascism propaganda, which was seen, you know, in the 40s as being a threat to America, which they were. But in the 50s, communism was a deep threat to America. Actually, that statement's kind of true and it's kind of not. There is a lot of truth that communism was a threat, but there was a lot of hysteria. And a lot of the hysteria came from this idea that these values were infiltrating American society. And groups like the House of the Un-American Activities Committee began to look for examples of, in particular in Hollywood, screenwriters committing acts of propaganda. You know, there was this paranoia that cinema was being used as a tool by the commies to turn good Americans into communists. And there was a background of communist activity in America. People were part of the Communist Party in America leading up to World War II. It was quite different, though, to what was happening in Europe. I mean, they were a little bit naive, if you like. The reality of what was happening in Soviet Russia was quite different to what was happening in America. Most American communists had become communists because they hated racism and they hated fascism. But because of that, they were labelled communists and on the left. And by the time the rest of the world got very frightened of communism, you know, when countries like Russia and China and started getting very powerful in the 50s, America just freaked out, and there's this massive anti-communist sentiment spread through the land, and it had to get stamped out at all costs. Okay, so let's get to On the Waterfront. The director, Elia Kazan, was a member of many leftist and communist organisations, the Actors Studio and other political groups back in the day. But like many people, he left those groups. It became somewhat embarrassing to be part of those groups, and then it became seen as something subversive. So he moved on. And when the House of Un-American Activities Committee started getting people to come before them to testify, he was what they called a friendly witness. So he went before this committee and named names. He told them, I denounce my leftist past, and these are friends of mine who I know were communists and still are. I'm going to give you names. So he basically informed on his friends, and you know, and this resulted in people having to leave the country. This destroyed the careers of many Hollywood screenwriters, actors and directors. Charlie Chaplin got booted out of America. I mean, this is the first Hollywood star, but he got labelled a communist because he made a film that was critical of Hitler. I mean, that's sort of how nuts it was back then. So Kazan informed. Kazan did what Terry Malloy did, and he ratted on his friends. And what gets really interesting is he's trying to look back into history now and decide what made him do that. Was he just trying to save his own skin? Was it the lesser of two evils? You know, he may not have been able to work himself if he didn't inform on his friends. Or was he just trying to save his own hide? I mean, it's a hell of a decision, and it's easy for us to judge. And I personally don't think it's cool what he did, but I've got no idea how I may have responded in that situation. What I think was going... Did you want to leap in?
Well... Carry on. I was just going to ask you to sort of talk at that point too about the degree to which you think the film is actually a defence, because Kazan said quite a few times, oh, it's got nothing to do with the HUAC committees. Like, he was very clear that was separate. But obviously the parallels are so strong. And so what degree you think, yeah, he was doing that to vindicate himself somehow? This
was the first film he made after testifying, and I think this film reads as his rationale for why he testified. This film is so about him testifying. I don't care what he says.
Yeah.
I think it's impossible to really look at this film critically without understanding this bit of history. This is a film about the righteousness of informing. This is the goodness of ratting in on your friends for the good of the country. Kazan was what they called a centrist director in that he loved social cohesion, and this was big in the 50s. He liked stability. He was a patriot. His family were immigrants, and they'd fled they'd fled Greece due to a lot of the anti-Greek Anatolian violence, and America was the land of golden opportunity for him, and he loved the country, and he loved stability. He loved community. So I think it's wrong to think of left and right in this sense. I don't think he was a conservative. I don't think he was a right-winger. He just wanted social cohesion, and to him the threat was any form of radicalism and extremism. And radicalism and extremism could be crime, it could be communists, it could be corrupt union thugs. And in cinema this was reflected further as, aliens often represented this dangerous force from the outside. Teenage delinquents was something they were very frightened of in the 50s. But yeah, communists were the big ones. So I think I think he believed he was doing the right thing for the good of the country, and what this film represents is the importance of maintaining social control, keeping the good of the community together, and in this sense, informing on people was what you did to maintain that social control. It's
interesting that you say that now. I know at the time there were a few critics who looked at the film and called Kazan a bit of a fascist, especially the last scene of On the Waterfront where he gets up and he's obviously, it's social cohesion, but it's sort of social cohesion led by one person. The rest of the workers are sort of standing around in just waiting for the next leader to come along, and Terry Malloy stumbles up and takes over and leads again. And I was wondering what you think that sort of says about Kazan's idea of the workers too. What is the worker as a character in the film? Are they a mob?
The ending's really ambiguous.
Yeah.
The ending is a very difficult one to interpret, and it throws out a lot of other theory I have about the film, just out the window. What I think this film is expressing is the technique of divide and conquer, and basically turning a dissident force to your favour. And I don't think it's fascist. I think, Terry Malloy might be the protagonist and the central character, but I don't think he's the active agent in this film. He's manipulated throughout the entire film. I think the characters pulling the string are Edie Doyle and Father Barry. So Edie Doyle in this film represents the good, stable social institution of the family and religion. Of the family. And Father Barry obviously represents the good, stable social institution of the church. And together they solve the extremism by infiltrating the mob. So the mob are also the unionists, and they are symbolic of the communists. And they pick out the dissident elements, the element that is not too sure, the element that they can twist their way of thinking, so he can work from within to remove the radical element from society. And that dissident element, of course, is Terry Malloy. He is the one who's vulnerable to being manipulated, to stop hanging out with the mob and to start doing the right thing and to come back to society. And society in this film is sort of defined as the church and family. Which is the other sort of context for this film, is that on the original movie posters it's all the story of the redemption of Terry Malloy, and Kazan sold it very much as this one man's story and one man's struggle, and often said that he thought that would be the thing that would make the film sort of eternal. What would keep us here over 50 years later looking at this film again was this redemptive struggle theme that runs through it. Of course, now what we've just sat and talked about was the political context the whole time, and that sort of, how do you think On the Waterfront has stayed contemporary? Why are we still looking at it now? I think for a start, it's just a really good film, and that kind of grittiness and attempt to capture what it was like on the waterfront. I mean, the cameras were literally on the streets of New York shooting this film. I think there's something like a total of 2 scenes inside a studio. They used the language of the time. Actors were doing this whole method acting thing, so they weren't kind of rehearsed and poised and proper. They were drawing on their own experiences and their own kind of gut emotions, which is why they do things like stumble over lines, improvise, mumble. I mean, whoever thought mumbling would be cool and sexy? But
anything Marlon Brando does is cool and sexy.
Yeah, exactly, and he works it. And so I think the film, it does still have that authenticity to it. I think it feels real. It does have a documentary almost look to it. The lighting, it's a lot flatter. There's no dramatic... There are some scenes of dramatic lighting, but as a whole, the lighting is there to make it look very flat and everyday. The music is of the era and of the time. It's not sort of, again, a big orchestral score that's been brought in by the studio orchestra. So I think that kind of grittiness translates well. And I think the other reason the film has lived on is because it does tell us so much about some of the political tussles that were happening in the 50s. I think it reflects a lot of the arguments they were having.
I mean, sadly, too, it was based on a real series of investigations that were happening with it. I think it was the New York Post, from memory, had done a series of investigative pieces on the waterfront and on the crime and corruption that was happening down there. And then the film came out in like 54 and it had this huge reception. Everyone was like, woohoo, this is amazing. Look at the potential for political change. They had an election on the waterfront, and the sort of Terry Malloy characters came very near to winning but didn't actually win. And it was a strange thing that, that wasn't actually the truth of the waterfront at all, and it went on to be gang-controlled for the next, decade or who knows how long. Look, we've got The Wire now. We've got the next On the Waterfront.
Well, that's a good point, actually. What you've kind of introduced here is the film is more the illusion of reality. I mean, this film has a kind of, if you believe the social cohesion argument, it does have something of a happy ending. And it does feel real, but this story in real life would not have resolved this way. I mean, if Terry Malloy informed on these guys, he would have wound up with a dagger in his back floating down in the water somewhere. I mean, that is what happened in the era to people who informed on the mob. So the film does have an artificial happy ending. That, it wouldn't have gone down like that.
I guess I want to ask you too, and in a moment we'll open up to questions for you guys, so do keep them in head. Since you're here and we're talking about film, and I think this is one of the few chances we're going to have to talk about film in Text in the City, and you're an expert in this, can you talk a little bit to the idea of how it's different to write about film as opposed to novels as a text, and what way you should discuss linguistically when you're writing exams, films?
I just remembered what I was going to say before, of course.
Go for it. Do both.
Sorry, I had that kind of moment, and I thought, what was I saying? And it was that you're absolutely right again about the corruption in the union. So audiences at the time would have had that in the back of their mind. So what they were seeing was issues that they identified with. Okay, writing about film as opposed to writing about a novel. What I'm going to say now sounds kind of really obvious, but it's important. It's an important thing to say because you're not writing about a novel. Film is not literature. If you start thinking about it in literary terms, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. So film is a lot more than what the characters say and what the story is. You need to talk about visual style, and working an analysis of visual style into your essays and exams will give you that edge. That's your evidence to talk about aspects of character. So, talking about the use of setting and the importance of realism in this film will give you an edge. Think of that scene where Terry, he's at a crossroads. He's sort of got one foot in the gang family and one foot in the good family of Edie. Think about the scene where he goes to tell her that he was involved in the death of her brother, and he's standing on that sort of little pile of rocks.
I love that scene. That's one of my favourite scenes, actually.
Well, this is a really good scene to do a visual analysis of, because it's that pile of rocks, and he's sort of, he's elevated. He's sort of the man on top of his little pile of rocks, and look at me, I've got this sort of aspect, I've got this degree of status because I'm part of the mob. But then the camera pulls right back after he's told her what he's done and she's left very distressed. The camera pulls right back, and he's suddenly tiny in the landscape with New York City looming up behind him, and you can see the Statue of Liberty, and he feels so small in this big city, and the respectable, the city where the power really lies is so far behind him. It's a really good moment to show us that his power base is small and quite imagined compared to the big picture.
Also the use of sound in that film, the use of silence as opposed to narrative sound there, where he has all the foghorns go off, so you don't actually hear what he says, and as the audience you're sort of imagining you don't need to hear it, like you don't need that extra exposition. It's just this great blah, and it's a
tremendous technique, to just bring home the enormity of that moment. Talk about the jungle metaphor in this film. There's all this, there is dialogue, but there's a lot of talk about how they're like animals, and the city in the waterfront is like the jungle, and the idea of Terry's sort of ascension to being a better person is partly this process of being civilised, and so you often get images of the jungle contrasting with images of civilization. And one of my favourite scenes, and I think a good scene to analyse because it's not necessarily an obvious one, is when he and Edie sort of crash at Irish wedding, and they sort of dance around, and again, he's from the mob world, she's from the good, stable family world, and they're trying to test each other out. That they're trying to both understand each other's views of the world, and they sort of dance around this space of this wedding, and they constantly waltz into these giant ferns. The whole place, the background looks like a jungle, and there are certain close-ups where it looks like they're getting engulfed in the ferns. And the other visual motif that's really interesting in that scene, and you get in a lot of the exterior scenes with the pair, is the use of smog and fog. Smoke and fog. Smog and fog literally appear in the film to indicate, I suppose, his moral confusion. His mind is cloudy, and every time he sort of has one of these moments where he's thinking, oh, maybe I've chosen the wrong path, he walks through fog. That scene, the Irish wedding scene, he gets approached by one of the thugs, he gets approached by the crime commission, and then he walks through this massive cloud of cigarette smoke that just comes out of nowhere. And stuff like that's not accidental. It looks like it is, and when we're watching the film as just a viewer having a bit of fun, we may not notice. But things like someone has decided at this moment of the film there's a massive cloud of smoke he needs to walk through to indicate that he's in a bit of no man's land at the moment, not too sure what to do next.
It's amazing what you pick up when you watch and rewatch a film. Like, new things are coming out at you all the time. When I first watched On the Waterfront, I loved it. I was mainly distracted for obvious reasons. And then the second time and the third time I watched it, Edie's character became much more central to me, and I began to watch her much more closely. And for me personally, Edie's character is one of the great downfalls of On the Waterfront. She starts out as this amazing, strong woman. She's physically unafraid. She jumps in and is in the tussle at the shake-up at the beginning. She's really present. She's very no, you're not enough, Marlon, I want more from you. Then the moment that he starts to give her that, suddenly she becomes this very docile woman, very oh no, let's run away, all my courage is gone, I'm now just a little motif for you to do whatever you want with, Kazan. And I was just wondering what you thought of the role of gender in the film too, how that informs Marlon's character as well as Edie's. But
look, it's problematic. The question is, there's two questions. One is, has Hollywood from day one up until now been pretty disgraceful with the way it portrays women on screen in general, and often relegates them to minor roles, massive failure to explore women's stories, and often have them as symbols and not very active? The answer to that is yes. Hollywood's been abysmal with women in general. Does this film stand out in particular, though, as one of the more guilty examples? I don't think so. I think it's just indicative of a kind of crap trend, if you know what I mean. I'm not trying to defend the film, but I don't think it's anything extraordinary in its very average treatment of the female character. I think it's just indicative of what was happening, especially in the 50s. I mean, Edie in this film is more a symbol. She, even though she's sort of one of the active... I think her and the father are the two elements of the film that kind of drive the narrative. She's still a very two-dimensional, symbolic character. Yeah, she's there to... She was discovered for this film. She wasn't unknown. She wasn't considered yet a big professional actor either. That was part of Kazan's whole keeping it real. He often cast unknowns and non-professionals. But you know, she's cast because she looks angelic, and you know, you could backlight her so her hair would look radiant and like a halo. She's cast because she looks stunning, and the character is simply there to represent education and family. It's not only that she's sort of the force that's going to probably marry him and establish a good family, but she's, you know, she went to convent school, for heaven's sakes.
Really drives it home, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's as socially cohesive as you can get. So she's such an agent of good in this kind of centralist film. She does contrast, though, to the way women are presented in more hysterical films.
Yeah.
So these centrist films, which are all about social cohesion, often had women as the stable force for society. In your more hysterical films, whether they were on the left side of the politics, the right side of politics, films that suggested society was no good and it was all about rampant individualism, women are often portrayed as the force of danger. They were the exact opposite of the civilising character that Edie is. They were seen as being aligned very closely with nature. And the centrists and the conservatives hated nature. That was uncontrollable, that was unpredictable. And so women were seen as dangerous, violent and destructive. Going back to what I said, that Hollywood usually portrays a male point of view. And I don't know, us blokes are so insecure. You just look at cinema and you think, wow, what's wrong with us?
That's a question maybe for another talk at the Wheeler Centre. Speaking of backlighting here, we're going to take some audience questions from you. So if anyone's got a question that they'd like to address to Thomas, maybe pop your hand up now. I've always got plenty more if you don't, but I'm sure you've got them there. Anyone? Think towards December this year and everything that you'll need to know.
Yeah.
Try not to panic while you're doing it. Was that a hand up the back? Yep, go for it.
What are the most significant cinema techniques used in the film?
You warned me I'd get this question.
I did warn you'd get this question.
I think that that general approach to realism, I think it is important to note that that was very different to other styles of film. And what that realism meant to audiences at the time was, this is a serious film. You know, we're not talking about wisecracking gangsters, we're not talking about Dracula and Frankenstein or aliens. This is a serious film reflecting the real issues of the day. So all the aspects of, you know, they filmed on the streets, the actors were method actors, the lighting appeared naturalistic, was there to create that sense of realism. I would also talk about the use of height, the sense that to get away from the jungle on the street, the higher up you get, the more privileged it was for your character, and there was some kind of better place up above the city, and that's where Terry and his pigeons occupy. Well, we've got to get to the pigeons. That's where Terry and his pigeons occupy, and Joey, the guy who gets murdered at the start of the film, is literally thrown off this elevated place back into the scum in the city. When talking about lighting, there are one or two scenes where the lighting is dramatically unrealistic, and they borrow lighting techniques from a style or a genre known as film noir. So this is a very stylised type of film. I could go on for hours about this. I'll make it brief. It's a very stylised type of film where often the city is portrayed as a dangerous and foreboding place. And one of the favourite techniques was using a lot of sort of side lighting to cast these very dramatic shadows over the innocents. So I think when they're escaping from the church and the scene where they're running in the street right before they find Charlie's body, they use a lot of this film noir lighting. So it's, you know, the villainous elements literally casting shadows over the good elements. And I think the final use of style you've got to talk about a lot is all the crucifix that appear in the film. The symbolic, the crucifixion symbols and the whole idea of martyrdom is rampant. Just all the masts of the ship sort of looming up out of shot, Charlie getting hung on the hook like he's been crucified, Terry lying face down in the water after he's taken his redemptive beating.
I think even in the hold scene after one of the Dugan dies, there's even like a cross just in the background made out of like boxes and stuff that's sitting there in the shadows.
Hey, there is too, yeah. And you've got that wonderful
really
scene with the father.
Yeah, where he's standing in front of like just a randomly placed, it's not a real cross, but it's just so, it's sort of like,
and the ascension out of that after he does his sermon.
Yeah.
Even the bullet holes in Charlie's heart after he gets shot are the shape of a crucifix.
Really?
Yeah, I noticed that for the first time only recently.
Okay. We're going to talk about pigeons now, unless there's another one. So you quick, put your hands up. There, yeah, maybe next. And then I think there was one up the back after that I saw a hand go up.
I could be wrong, but to my knowledge, colour film was available, but Kazan chose to film in black and white. I guess that's to enhance the grittiness, but did you have any other comments on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It was, and that was sort of what newsreels looked like, and that was, you know, colour was still quite expensive. It was still being introduced. They used colour for more big scale, big lavish productions, and colour was associated at the time also with melodrama. I mean, Kazan's next film, East of Eden, which introduced James Dean to the world, I mean, he knew how to pick his actors. That was a big colour film, and it's very melodramatic. It's very, really over-the-top, intense emotions. And it's also a glorious film. But yeah, he wasn't going for melodrama. That was not what he wanted. This was stark, bleak, documentary-style reality, and the black and white achieved that much better than colour.
And for us, strangely too, I think later on, we now look back at it and see a very black and white sort of statement too. Like often the director's intention isn't always what you get from the film in the end. And like now we look back at it and we see this very stark right and wrong, which is, yeah, just ironic. There was another question up the back. Thanks.
Besides rewatching the movie, what can we do to kill our English exams?
Did you say what can you do to get out of them? Or
no, to kill them.
To kill them. Practice writing on the texts, which I hated doing in Year 12. My teachers used to say to me, keep writing sample essays, and I thought, why would I do that? But boy, it makes a difference. Practice writing about aspects of film style and, you know, and literary style, and writing about characters and themes. Practice writing. And speaking just about the film now, is you're going to need to watch it quite a few times. I think it's really good to watch it just to see it. Just go to it as if you're an audience member and enjoy it. But then on future viewings, you need to have the pen and paper and the pause button ready and start taking intense notes. As you're seeing stuff, note it down. I think reading text guides and, you know, third-party resources can help to a degree, but you're going to get so much better material if you've watched the film and discovered it yourself.
Yeah, I think that's really important, what Thomas is saying about having your own discovery of the film too. The most important thing that you're going to be able to bring to your English exam is yourself, and having your own relationship, building your own relationship like Thomas has with all these films, just through watching it, and what it makes you feel, like what your gut reaction to the film is, will probably, like, if you like you're saying, if you read too many text guides, you're just going to say what everybody else is going to say. So your own opinion, your own feelings about the film are probably the best thing you can bring.
Yeah, listen to what your gut is telling you about the film, and then work out a way to rationalise your emotional experience to the writing, if that makes sense. Because I think your writing will be more pure then if it's coming from this is how I felt about the film, now I need to form the argument to articulate why I felt this, will be a lot more effective. With this film in particular, you're going to hate this, but it actually screened at ACME less than a week ago. There's a film called Letter to Eli. It's a 2010 film that Martin Scorsese co-directed. It's just a tribute to director Elia Kazan, and there's a very long section of it where Scorsese analyses On the Waterfront and gives a heap of background information about what it meant to Kazan personally. So Letter to Elia. I'm sure you probably have techniques of finding stuff like that more advanced than me.
I didn't see another hand there. Is there another hand up? Up the front here, I can see one.
Whose redemption do you think is greater, Charlie's or Terry's?
Ooh.
I think Terry. I think the film certainly thinks Terry. The tragedy of Charlie's redemption is it comes maybe an hour before he gets killed. It comes right at the end. And I think Charlie is his own redemption. He makes peace with himself and he makes peace with his brother, where Terry's redemption is taking on the sin of all the workers. Him getting beaten for the team is Jesus getting crucified for the sins of humanity. I think that's the symbolism which I think is quite strong in the film. So all the workers who are quiet, who never informed, who never said anything, Terry takes all the punches and the blows for them. So I think, absolutely Terry's. The other funny thing just to note about Charlie's redemption, though, and this is a clever bit of writing, the one tricky aspect about this film is we were encouraged to think, go on, Terry, inform, you've got to inform. The one thing that we were a bit uncomfortable about is that him informing will include informing on his own brother, so betraying his bloodline, his own family. The film very conveniently kills off the brother so that moral difficulty gets removed.
I hadn't thought about that. Was there another hand just behind that there? Yes, in the glasses.
Sorry, Joey.
I suppose that it's kind of difficult, like, when we're analysing it, because they say that the contender scene is really, like, pivotal and infamous, but it's kind of really ambiguous. So I just feel like if you could make some notes about the contender scene and, like, some techniques in there.
Yeah, somebody asked me this last week, actually, after a lecture. And, look, I think the contender scene is a sensational piece of filmmaking, and I think it's a sensational piece of acting, where, again, largely improvised, and it's like the camera vanishes and you're alone in that cab with these two brothers with so much pain. It's a scene that I think is worth examining in your essays, but I don't think it's one of the strongest scenes to write about critically, necessarily. What you do get from it, though, is an enormous amount of character information about Charlie and Terry, and their relationship is resolved in that scene. And we find out, I think, a lot more about the backstory of who Terry is and how he's been treated by his brother and these other union men. And a sense that Charlie has been beaten down all his life. I mean, he's been abused, he's been ridiculed, he's constantly told he's like a kid or he's dumb. There's a lot of this stuff in the film to suggest that, the mob keeping him under control by belittling him in a way. And all this comes out in that scene. And it's also when he, I think, finally realises that systematically through his life he's been played by the mob, and he realises they aren't the friends, they aren't the good family that he thought they were. I mean, that's the scene where I think he decides, I've now got to go and do the right thing. And Charlie realises that as well and has his, redemption that lasts for a good hour. So visually, it's an amazing scene, more from an artistic point of view. I think to write about it critically, though, that's where you do focus on the dialogue and what's being said between the brothers. And but yeah, at the same time, you want to talk about the anguish on those men's faces during that scene. I mean, they communicate a lot of the pain just in the way they look that goes way beyond the words being spoken.
As far as the technique going, like if you have to discuss technique in that scene too, interestingly there's only sort of the one technique. It's the people. And so method acting as a technique sort of is the only thing you can take filmically. And ironically, the accident of the moment, which is that idea of method acting, and then the accident that they didn't have the background moving either in that scene, which is why the Venetian blind is down, isn't it? They didn't have the money, it all fell through, and so just through accident they had this amazing claustrophobia in that scene.
And actually, you've got me thinking more and more about it now. It's also an intensely private moment in a film where a lot is on public display and there's a lot of scrutiny, and the camera gets tight, so you get close-ups and medium close-ups. The camera gets closer to those actors continuously for that scene to an extent that you don't see anywhere else in the rest of the film. It's the most intimate, personal moment, and it's not between Terry and his love interest, it's between Terry and his brother, and that is the central conflict of this film. Terry being torn between two versions of family: the false family of the mob, who are, animalistic, uncivilised, and the radical element, and then the true good family of society and social cohesion, which is civilised and church and family. And this is the film where he finally really confronts the one element holding him back to the false family, and ironically that element is somebody who he is blood related to.
Rod Steiger is just so beautiful in that scene too, and in one of the featurettes on one of the DVD versions of On the Waterfront, Rod Steiger talks about how he didn't actually play the close-ups of himself to Marlon because Marlon had to go to therapy at 4 o'clock every afternoon, and it was built into his contract. But Rod Steiger didn't realise that Marlon Brando was in analysis at the time, and Marlon Brando just ran off halfway through the scene, and Rod Steiger said he was just so betrayed and so hurt and so angry, and it comes out in his face as he's doing the scene.
Yeah, right. He's kind
Interesting
of
trivia.
He's kind of pathetic too, Charlie.
Yeah.
I really feel for him because he is quite a weak character. I mean, Marlon Brando is so masculine and manly, and in the context of the film, in a really, in the sense of him being a proper man who'll do the right thing, where Charlie's kind of whiny and pathetic and putting on a show of being a tough guy.
Okay, I think we're going to close up for questions now because we're drawing towards the end of our time. But we're going to be here next week doing Crucible, and we'd love to see you all back again with all your questions in tow. But before that, I'd like to just make sure that we give Thomas Caldwell a big round of applause. You can check out his blog at Cinema Autopsy. Thank you.
Thank you. Hope that was okay.
And thank you all so much for coming, and we hope to see you for the rest of the series.